Welcome, my name is Jeff Pasley. I'm Associate Director of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy and Professor of History here at the University of Missouri on the planet Earth. The Kinder Institute, for those of you viewing at home, is a interdisciplinary academic center located on campus, actually in the fourth floor of Jesse Hall. As of July, we are a partnership between the political science and history departments dedicated to the research and teaching on American political thought and history, emphasizing the foundations but extending to applications and implications in lots of other time periods, including some of the more recent time periods and around the world. What we've got here today is it's kind of a complicated thing to explain what it is. I'd like to welcome you to this Pulitzer Prize Centennial Campfire Lecture. I don't know if campfire is quite the word for anything in this room. It's a theoretical campfire, a crystal blazing or something. But what we're doing is celebrating 100 years of Pulitzer Prize winners in their home states. These have been going on all over the country, but today's event has been organized in partnership with the Missouri Humanities Council. So we'd like to thank the Pulitzer Foundation, the Missouri Humanities Council, and their executive director, Steve Belko, and Thomas Kane of our staff for making this all possible. The Pulitzer Foundation obviously is the ultimate sponsor. And of course, the Missouri School of Journalism and the Reynolds Journalism Institute for hosting this event. But really, the Missouri School of Journalism should be the host because we are celebrating one of their faculty members, actually, Charles G. Ross, who was, of course, and we're going to hear about this in a minute, who was a faculty member here at the Missouri School of Journalism before he went on to St. Louis Post-Dispatch and wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning article, The Country's Plight. So we've broken our campfire here into two parts. Our main guest today, Eric Rauchway, will be going second to put the article into broad historical context. First, I wanted to introduce the warm-up man, one of our journalism school hosts who's agreed to introduce us a bit more specifically to Charles G. Ross, or Charlie Ross, as he was known, the journalist. Tim P. Voss is Associate Professor and Chair of the Journalism Studies faculty here at the Missouri School of Journalism. He's the author and editor of many different publications, most recently, and I say according to his website because I'm assuming that Tim's been keeping up his website, so I got the most recent publications. Gatekeeping in Transition, published by Routledge, and Gatekeeping Theory, also published by Routledge. With that, I'm going to give up my gatekeeping duty and turn it over to Tim.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to be very brief. So the first part of this is sort of the kindling, and then you'll see the roaring campfire moment. I'm not really a biographer, but I have been asked to talk a little bit about Charlie Ross. And when this first came up, right away, I said to Professor Pasley, this is really interesting because, of course, you know he was one of the, if not the first professor of journalism at the journalism school, and that had been a bit of new information.
Which I totally knew.
Yeah, okay. But he was faking it to pull me in so that I would do this brief introduction now. His devious plan has suddenly become clear. Charlie Ross is pictured here on the left. That is Walter Williams in the middle. Walter Williams was the founding dean of the Missouri School of Journalism. Classes started in the fall of 1908. There's another faculty member there whose name is lost to posterity. So just another faculty member, probably have to meet her on someday. Walter Williams was a practicing journalist from here in Boone County. He along with many others, helped found the Missouri School of Journalism. He was the founding dean, and then he pulled together the faculty. Exactly who was hired in what order is probably less important than the fact that Charlie Ross was one of the very first members of the faculty here. And he had only graduated from the University of Missouri, not with a journalism degree, of course, I believe it was English, just a few years earlier. But he had already begun a career at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and then would return to the Post-Dispatch after his several years as a faculty member here at the School of Journalism. So here's a picture of Ross in a classroom. And if it doesn't look like a classroom, that's because it was meant to be like a newsroom. So here he is teaching, okay, we're a little off the edge there, but he's teaching a class in news writing at the Missourian. And the means of instruction was very hands-on. It was learning by doing, and that became known as the Missouri method. But there was a bigger project that Walton Williams was interested in. It wasn't just teaching journalists to be good writers, but to think of themselves as public servants. He was Walter Williams was part of a project, and by extension Charlie Ross was part of a project of trying to professionalize the field of journalism. It had been a field of scoundrels and hard drinkers, and it was thought that there needed to be a level of professional commitment, and hence Walter Williams would even write what came to be known as the Journalist Creed, which begins with, I believe, in the profession of journalism. So there was this sense of public obligation. Ross is part of that project. In fact, he's a really important part of that project because he articulates sooner than anyone else, by my estimation, the notion of objectivity as a central sort of epistemological norm for journalism. I've written a history of how objectivity and how objectivity was taught, and as far as I can tell, the very first idea of trying to express how to engage in processes of verification to arrive at truth-telling was put forward by Charlie Ross. And he did that in his book in 1911. Michael Shedson, one of the great historians of not only objectivity, but the professionalization of journalism, points out that the notion of objectivity as a sort of articulate, coherent norm doesn't really come around until the late 20s, 1930s. So Ross was really starting that at a much earlier time. He also, by the way, he also taught a course in advertising at the journalism school. That would never be done today because it would be heresy for someone to teach news and advertising. Because there was the sense that there should be this wall of separation between the two. And he talked about a balance between the business and news functions of the press. So that was an early articulation of how the press could be a business and also be a profession. It was a profession with a business side. And again, he's one of the early articulate advocates of that notion. But he has a keen sense of the business side of journalism and the sort of economics of journalism and economics writ large as well. So he is also not only a leader, but I would say he's also a product of his time. There was this sense that the role of journalism, there were a number of roles for journalism, but one of the key roles was to be an educator of the public. So the role of journalism is education. So journalism has this explanatory function. Now you've walked through this, many of you have walked through the arch that comes through the journalism school, and you see "Why shall be the bearers of light." Rarely do you notice the other side, and it says the schoolmaster of the people. And that was the notion that the press could explain things in a way that equipped people to be citizens, to participate in public life. And that speaks to the kind of journalism that he did, and the kind of journalism that ultimately wins him awards. So he received a Pulitzer for correspondence. That's a category that no longer exists. The category now is explanatory journalism, and that's largely what he did, and that's what his piece is about. So he wins the Pulitzer Prize in 1932. And then the folks at the journalism school say, well, if he's good enough for a Pulitzer, I guess we'll give him our prize as well. So he got the Missouri Honor Medal. The Missouri Honor Medal was fairly new at that point. The citation for him winning the Honor Medal, you see just a couple of phrases up here in the upper right-hand corner. And both sort of speak to this role of the press being an sort of an educational institution and the kind of work that he did. You know, his scholarly interpretation, lucidly and interestingly expressed the great events of the day. You're going to hear when we get to the main campfire, that's what Charlie Ross was ultimately rewarded for. Later, he goes on to be the press secretary for Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman was his classmate in Independence, Missouri. He took on that job in 1945, and the job ended with him collapsing and dying at his desk. So on that upbeat note, he basically died on the job being the press secretary. But again, it was a role where he was to explain things in a way that people would understand. I'll leave it there.
All right, great. This is the part where we pray and cross our fingers and things.
Changing presentation, I will introduce him. But I'll also throw in, it's interesting that Charlie Ross is the inventor of objectivity, but the article, if you all read his article, it's basically, it explains a lot of things, but it's kind of an opinion piece. Yeah. You know, it's like much more like something you'd read in the New Yorker than something you'd read in most newspapers today. So it's interesting how that all worked out.
Hey.
Our main guest today is Professor Eric Rauchway from University of California, Davis, where he's been a professor since 2001. He previously taught at Oxford University. He's educated at Cornell University and went on for his PhD at Stanford University, which he earned in 1996. And since then, he's managed to own and publish 5 books and innumerable articles, chapters, and book reviews, plus write a blog, The Edge of the American West. The most recent, I guess I'll mention the most recent and relevant of Eric's books. The Great Depression and the New Deal, a very short introduction from Oxford University Press, 2008. And most recently, The Moneymakers, How Roosevelt and Keynes Ended the Depression, Defeated Fascism, and Secured Prosperous Peace, published last year by Basic Books. And we really appreciate Eric for taking time out of the end of his summer, which his school hasn't started yet. So we're all here in harness, and Eric could be doing something else, but he came here to come explain this stuff to us. So let's welcome Eric Rauchway.
Thanks very much to you, Jeff, and to Tim, and to all the folks at the Kinder Institute and the State Foundation for the Humanities and the Pulitzer Foundation and all the various hosts. And thanks to all of you for coming up. I don't know if I can live up to that campfire build up there, but we'll do our best. It's certainly a relief to know that journalism has expelled the scoundrels and the hard drinkers. If only you could turn your attention to the history departments, we'd all be a lot happier. So I've named the lecture here after the article, the Charlie Ross article, The Country's Plight, and then just want to talk to you a little bit about how we escaped it, to talk about why Ross would have been awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his analysis of the Great Depression, for that is, of course, the plight to which the title of the essay refers. Some of you may have come to the Ragtag last night to see the showing of Gabriel Over the White House, a 1933 film at the depth of the Great Depression, which talks about how to deal with it in a manner that's very different from the one that Charlie Ross proposed. If you haven't seen Gabriel, if you didn't come last night, you should briefly know that this is a film about the President of the United States becoming a dictator and what a great thing that was. So as you can see here, this is an inset from the movie where he says, Congress adjourns by overwhelming vote and makes the President Hammond a dictator. The president goes about establishing a paramilitary program for federal employment, as well as martial law to get rid of the gangster problem, and summary courts-martial for major criminals, like this one depicted here. Remember, this is meant to be a good thing.
That was filmed in this room, right?
I didn't know what this room was going to look like. I otherwise might have held my critique of the architecture, but this looks kind of, to me, like a sort of dystopian science fiction thing from the 1960s. But in fact, it is a utopian 1933 vision of what, again, a fascist America might be like, where the guilty are put to summary trial and then shot by firing squad in front of the Statue of Liberty, right? So this is, again, a good part of the movie where the good guys are winning. This is odd in itself. It's maybe a little bit more interesting and possibly a little bit more sinister if we know that this movie was authored and produced by William Randolph Hearst, another major figure in the history of journalism, who was probably the most powerful newspaper publisher of the day, had a circulation of approximately 15 million for his newspapers alone, whose newsreels and whose motion pictures reached many more people, and who already had on his masthead in 1933 the motto, "America First." And so this motto, this idea of an American fascism, which was very congenial to the politics of William Randolph Hearst in 1933, who also had Mussolini and Hitler writing columns for him at the time, tells us something about how dire the situation was in the United States in 1933, where people were seriously contemplating the possibility of an American fascism, right? So this is a depth in American history, not only for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. The nation is really in a state of crisis, perhaps unlike any other, barring the Civil War or the Revolution, right? So let's talk a little bit about the Depression and recovery. And for our discussion this evening, it's my ambition to talk a little bit about the country's plight, which is to say, in lowercase, the idea of how severe the problem was at the time that Ross wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning article. Then talk a little bit about what Ross says in the article in terms of his analysis and also his proposed solutions for the nation's problem, and then to talk about what actually was done about it, hence the subtitle of my talk, How We Escaped It, which is neither Gabriel over the White House nor Edward Ross, but in fact a different thing entirely. So let's begin where Charlie Ross says we should begin, which is we must know the facts. So again, I guess that's another paean to objectivity, which he expresses there in the 1931 essay. Only we have the benefit of hindsight, and we can say a bit more about the Great Depression and the facts of the Great Depression than Ross was able to in 1931. So this is the real reason for having this, this presentation, is so we can have charts, because everybody loves a good chart. This is the graph of United States real gross domestic product adjusted for inflation gross domestic product, right? This is from the period 1921 to the period 1940, so roughly from the post-war depression after World War I to almost the beginning of World War II. Gross domestic product, or GDP, I'm sure you know, it's a measure of the market value of all the goods and services produced within a country. There are a lot of things wrong with GDP as a measure of economic activity, but it is what we use, right? It is what we use. When you see a reporter on television, a journalist saying, the economy grew by X percent, what they mean is real gross domestic product grew by X percent, right? This is what we are talking about when we talk about the economy, for better or worse. And the one thing it does measure quite well is growth, right? Economic growth over time. Now, you would expect GDP to continue a broadly upward trend over time because there are more Americans over time. More people means more stuff, right? So there should be more economic activity over time. So if you imagine a trend, let's not imagine a trend, let's look at the trend, right? The trend line for gross domestic product over time is broadly upwards because the population keeps growing. So with more people, there should be more stuff. Which means that if you have an absolute drop in real GDP, even a relatively modest one, off of that upwards trend, you are taking away stuff from the more and more people who there are over time. And one of considerable magnitude, like the one you see here in the center of this chart, is one for a cause for great concern. This is, of course, the crisis that precipitates the Great Depression beginning in 1929 and bottoming out there in 1933. And just so we're clear, when Charlie Ross writes the country's plight, or our country's plight, there it is, right, that's right about there, right? So he's not even looking at the worst of the Great Depression, and already he's talking about a dire and unprecedented situation in American economic history, one that inspires very serious rethinking, as Ross says, of whether the capitalist system can survive, whether democracy can survive. And by the time you get to the actual bottom of the Great Depression here, when you have unemployment levels that are approaching 25%, right, when an army of the unemployed is actually camped on the National Mall, right, and posing apparently some kind of threat to the nation's peace, the possibility of a fascist movement seems very real indeed. Right? So this sense of crisis is real and long-lasting. Let's talk a little bit about how severe this contraction actually is. You'll see here that we begin this chart a little bit below the trend line. There was a recession, as I say, after World War I. In it, real GDP fell to maybe 96%, right, of its previous level. So that's a considerable drop. In the recession, the Reagan Era Recession, 1981-82, again, real GDP fell to 96-98% of its previous level. In the Great Depression, this contraction right there, you see a drop to 73%, right, of its previous level. So this is a drop of considerable magnitude, and not only that, it lasts a long time. If there's anything better and more exciting than a chart, it's a table. Here we have a table. This table shows us the official dates for timing of business cycles in American history. These are as established by the Business Cycle Dating Committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is what their job is, to determine where the economy peaks and where it bottoms out or reaches a trough. So you see the troughs are here, you see the peaks are there, and you see the contraction, which is the shrinking period from a peak to a trough, the length of time, and then the expansion in months, the return to prosperity from the trough to the peak. And if we kind of, let's see how well this works. If I fade in my graph from the previous slide, right, we can see here that we begin with this graph here in this trough in July of 1921 about. We see a rise to a cyclical peak here in 1923, and then there's a fall again to another trough in 1924, not very far fall, and then a rise again to another peak in 1926, and then to a pre-crash peak there in August of 1929, and then the big drop down to to March of 1933 there. When we talk about these peaks and troughs and this big drop here, that means there's a period of 43 months during which the economy was shrinking. So month on month, economic activity in the United States, in real inflation-adjusted terms, is getting to be less and less. Less and less is produced for almost 4 years. Right? It's a long time, as you can see, previous contractions, 7, 18, 14, 13 months, then 43 months, right? That's a big difference. That's obviously a difference in magnitude so great, you can understand why at the time they would have felt it to be a difference in kind, that something different had happened that differed from previous recessions. And that's what we call this period of contraction, right? In macroeconomics, this is a recession where the economy is shrinking. There's a fairly precise definition of what a recession is, of what a contraction is. What there isn't a precise definition of is this word depression. Right? The depression is this thing that happened in the 1930s. It's a historically specific thing, and it is peculiar to that moment. And we use it to refer not only to the period of the contraction, but in fact the whole long period during which the United States economy remained below that trend line, that black trend line on that graph. So it also refers to this long period of recovery. Remember, these are the expansions over here in this column. There's this long period of recovery after the Depression bottoms out right there in 1933, longer even than the recession. So when we think about the Depression, we're thinking about both this contraction and this recovery, and that's a relatively imprecise way of talking about it because they're obviously two different and importantly different things. Broadly speaking, contraction bad, recovery good. Right? And so we want to look at that inflection point there at the bottom, which is slightly after Charlie Ross's article, and think about how that happens. So we think about where the contraction begins in August of 1929 and where the recovery begins there in March of 1933. Right? There is one other thing that we can say about those dates in American history. It's not entirely fair to say it, but why not? Let's say it. This is when the Hoover presidency begins and when the Franklin Roosevelt presidency begins. This is not entirely fair because, of course, Herbert Hoover didn't cause the Great Depression. Right? But he also didn't make it better. This is important to understand that there is this period of essentially the entirety of Hoover's presidency where things are getting worse. So when Ross is writing again in 1931, he's writing about not only the system, right, being in trouble, but also our particular interpretation of the system, which is the system under the Republican president, Herbert Hoover, who is the third in a line of 3 Republican presidents going back to World War I. And all of a sudden, it's the idea of the Republican version of capitalism that's really in question as the Depression deepens and deepens and deepens on Herbert Hoover's watch. The other thing we can say about this in terms of political terms is you can see that as Roosevelt comes into office, which he's inaugurated in March of 1933, the economy is recovering and recovering. There's a dip there in 1937-38, and then it recovers and recovers again. And even this is without before we get to World War II, where, of course, war production grossly increases gross domestic product. This period, then, politically, is the period that we would refer to as the New Deal. So spoilers, part of the answer to the subtitle of this talk is how we escaped the country's plight is the New Deal. Right? But what do we mean by that, and what is it, how does it that worked? And so when I talked about, at the beginning, about the country's plight, that's the situation, right? You have this almost 4-year drop in economic productivity. You have a rise in unemployment to almost 25%. You have a rapid turnaround in March of 1933, and you have the beginning of a recovery. Now, what did Charlie Ross see, and how did he think about this when he talked about the country's plight? So that's the second thing I wanted to talk about. Ross's analysis roughly breaks down into these 4 problems. And the most important of them to him is what he calls the maldistribution of wealth, which is to say, the money is not in the hands of the people who would spend it, which are the poorer people. Ross, in his 1931 essay, talks about actually the 2% of the population who own most of the wealth. Nowadays, we have the 1%. But it's a familiar analysis, I'm sure, that you would have no trouble sort of imagining yourself into as you read Ross's essay. And he thinks that that's the principal problem, that if wealth were more evenly distributed, if poorer people had more money to spend, they would spend it. There would be more economic activity. We would no longer have this kind of problem. Another part of the problem, though, is that the boom of the 1920s relied on an overextension of consumer credit. Looking back, we can say that Ross is onto something there, that household debt approximately doubled over the decade after World War I. For the first time in United States history, ordinary people are going into credit to buy ordinary things. We think about the boom of the 20s and the innovation of purchasing automobiles on credit, automobiles that had planned obsolescence, where credit was extended by the company that made them with the idea that they were selling you that loan more than they're selling you the car, right? That's an innovation of the 1920s. And it extends to other forms of consumption for radios, right, for washing machines, for other household goods in this period. It's not at the magnitude, again, that we would have it today, but it's probably a phenomenon that we have a sort of qualitative sympathy and understanding of, that there was quite a bit of consumer credit. And of course, if the economy depends on ordinary people spending money that they don't have, see above under maldistribution of wealth, right? If you have something happen that shocks them into an expectation they're not going to be able to get that kind of credit, or they're not going to be able to pay off their debt, something like a massive stock market crash, let's just say, right? Then you would have people declining to borrow to buy stuff, and all of a sudden this great engine of economic activity would slow down and then grind to a halt, right? Because people are no longer borrowing to buy, their expectations about the future have changed, and so things fall apart. There are other things that Ross points to. Mechanization, again, this is something we see also in the headlines quite a bit today. Will robots take our jobs? And the overall analysis, though, is one of a reduction of purchasing power. A lot of what Ross identifies as the problems that are key to understanding the country's plight in 1931 are actually better recognizable as the ideas of another economist of this period, who is this guy, John Maynard Keynes, right, who is the principal proponent of the idea that what you saw in the Great Depression was a deficiency of purchasing power. Right? That's the consumer side, the demand side analysis of the Depression. That what you needed was for more demand in the economy. Because again, if you watch Gabriel over the White House, there were several references to food rotting in the fields while people go hungry. And that is an accurate assessment of what's going on in the Great Depression. There's plenty of stuff, there's plenty of people who want the stuff, but somehow the mechanism for them to get the stuff has broken down. So if only we could put more purchasing power in their hands, more money in their pockets, then we could get things moving properly again. There's a famous story about Keynes going to a fancy hotel on one of his visits to America. It's one of these hotels where they have the stack of towels, where you dry your hands and then you pitch the towel into a bin to be washed. And Keynes goes in and grabs a towel and then knocks all the rest of them off. And his friend says, why have you just done this, Maynard? And he says, economic stimulus, my dear boy. Right? The more work that you can make, right, the better off the economy will be. Keynes famously, sometimes infamously, proposed that what we should do is we should hire a bunch of guys to dig holes and bury money, and then hire another bunch of guys to dig holes and dig up the money again, and then we would have economic stimulus, you see, because there would be money in the economy that hadn't been there before. Ultimately, the Roosevelt administration comes to adopt a view of the Depression that is rather similar to both Ross's and Keynes, that the problem is of purchasing power. Now, Roosevelt, for political reasons, sees something that Ross stresses, Keynes does less, is that the real purchasing power is in agriculture, problem with purchasing power is in agricultural areas. That there has actually been a depression in agriculture that outlasts the Great Depression, generally goes all the way back almost to World War I, and that really what we need to do is to put money in the hands of farmers and the people who farmers employ, that there are so many of them that if they bought more stuff, that would goose the economy. And the way to do that is to raise agricultural prices. So if we look at this situation again with the real gross domestic product falling off a cliff here in 1929 and bottoming out there in 1933, what's going on there is a period of reduced economic activity that's driven in part by what I described with that reduction in borrowing to buy. What happens when people don't buy as much? Merchants, chasing those ever scarcer dollars, lower their prices. So maybe it's too much to offer my shirt at $100. I will offer my shirt at $50, right? And then maybe some more people will buy it. But if those people are still harboring, sort of dour expectations about the future, maybe they won't. And then merchants will lower prices again in chasing those still scarce dollars. As they lower prices, that means their profit margins are going to be slenderer, which means, of course, they're going to be able to afford to employ fewer people. As they lay off or fire people, dismiss people, right? Those people then are going to also have reduced purchasing power because now they don't have a job. They don't have the expectation of an income. They're going to buy fewer things. That's going to exert a downward pressure on prices again because there's less demand out there. So this is a vicious cycle, right? It's what economists call a deflationary spiral. As prices go down, people don't buy as much, people get fired, the people don't buy as much, prices go down, and it reinforces itself all the way down to some unknown bottom. If those people are in debt, it's even worse. Because as prices fall, incomes are falling, if not to zero, they're still getting lower. And so the money they have to pay back their debts is harder to come by than the money they borrowed. Right? They borrowed when prices were higher. It would have been easier to pay off the debts. As prices fall, it's harder to pay off the debts. So you have a situation where there's deflation, falling prices, and debt loads that are unendurable. As they don't pay off their debts, banks fail because they're not getting their income of people paying off their debts. As banks fail, people can't get their money. People have, again, lowered economic expectations about the availability of credit in the future. The whole thing becomes a kind of self-sustaining collapse in slow motion over a period, again, of almost 4 years. What do you do by the time you get to 1933? This fella, George Warren, is another state university employee. He's an agricultural economist at Cornell University in New York, and he's an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt in the beginning of Roosevelt's term. And he explains that one of the things you can do to get out of the Depression is to raise the price level to the debt level. The other is to lower the debt level to the price level. Our choice is between reflation and deflation. So if one thing you could do, if you have all of those bad debts out there that people can't pay, you could write them off. You could count them all as bankrupt. You could tell the banks they aren't going to get their money. As you do that, right, as you write off all of those debts, a lot of businesses are going to fail. A lot of people are going to lose their houses. A lot of people are going to lose their farms. Right? But eventually, if you eliminate all the bad debt off the books, you let prices fall all the way down to a level where they represent the real values in the economy, then people will again start to buy. In theory, things will bottom out. The other thing you could do, as he says here, is to raise the price level to the debt level. In other words, you could have reflation, as he says, which is a polite way of saying inflation. If you can find some way to raise prices, right, then people can pay off their debts again, and you could get this economic machine moving. Arithmetically, or from the standpoint of economic theory, either one would work. Right? Deflation is largely what the Hoover administration has been trying, infamously on the advice of Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, right, who says we must purge the rot from the system, to let everything fail, and then finally things will begin to move again of their own. But it seems not to have worked by the time Roosevelt's elected in 1932. More importantly, in Warren's mind, and in the mind of many people around Roosevelt, there are political costs to be paid of deflation that are too high to pay. And this, again, we want to put our minds in the context of Gabriel over the White House. And in what Warren was thinking of was Germany at the time, right? It seems to be a choice between a rise in prices or a rise in dictators. That if you look at the overlapping graphs here of German prices and German politics, you'll see that there is a fall in prices that correlates with the rise of fascism, right? That Hitler is brought to power by the crushing deflation of the Great Depression, and that is observable in other parts of Europe, but most notably in Germany. And it's something that the Americans around Roosevelt very specifically have in mind as a risk, right? That we will see increased support for fascism as deflation crushes our population, as bankruptcies endanger our population. So the solution, therefore, is to induce some kind of inflation. How do you do that? Well, the way the United States actually does it, and this is a graph made by the United States Treasury, is to go off the gold standard. And one of the things the Treasury observes is that other countries did this before the United States. So you see here, Italy devalues its currency, France devalues its currency, right? Then you have Japan and Argentina, and then you have the UK in 1931, and it's not till 1933 that the US will do similarly. But you can see from the illustration in the corner of the graph there that what they're doing is making the dollar worth less in terms of gold than it was before. In other words, they're allowing the human hand to determine what the money supply is worth, instead of tying it to a fixed amount of gold. And if you do that, people say, holy moly, who knows what President Roosevelt will do next with the dollar? And this, of course, again, is something we can think through in kind of deductive terms. If you have a suspicion, if you have a reasonable belief even, that the dollar that you hold now is going to be worth less tomorrow than it is today, you all of a sudden have an incentive to spend it that you did not have before. Right? In fact, when prices were falling, what was happening was any dollar you held was worth more every week that you held onto it. And so you have an incentive to avoid any non-mandatory purchases. Right? But if you reverse expectations, you say those crazy guys in the White House might change the value of the dollar at any minute, then people have an incentive to spend right away, because the money that they have will be worth less tomorrow than it is today. This is why macroeconomists generally point to this sort of fateful month right here in March of 1933. Roosevelt comes into office, he closes all the banks, remember, but the way he does that is by using his presidential power to control gold. Asks people to bring all their gold back into vaults, changes the value of the dollar in gold, changes it again over the course of the remainder of the year, making it worth less and less and less and less in gold. So giving people that expectation that their money will be worth less later than it is now, and inducing them to spend. So by radically changing people's expectations, right, Roosevelt induces demand. Keynes suggested that would be a fantastic idea, so also would be a public works program. Charlie Ross didn't actually talk about either of those things, right? He didn't talk about inflation at all, and he dismissed the idea of a public works program in his essay. What Ross wanted to see was progressive taxation, wanted to see public ownership of utilities to take away some of that private concentration of wealth. In his view, in 1931, one of the great contributors to private concentrations of wealth was private utility ownerships, that those monopolies were incredibly valuable. In fact, one of them led to the richness of Wendell Willkie, who later challenged Roosevelt for the presidency, right? He wanted to see a reduction of work hours, and Ross also wanted to see disarmament. Because we spend so much on arms, right, that money could be better spent on things that would make us prosperous. Now, the New Deal didn't include, right, much of Charlie Ross's agenda. Notably, it didn't include progressive taxation. The New Deal preserved a highly regressive tax regime that it inherited from the Republican administrations of 1932 and kept it in place right up until World War II. Then the tax regime became more progressive, but not until then. So they didn't use taxation to do this. And they didn't really, of course, disarm. As you know, the story of the 30s is not that of disarmament, sadly, right? There was a New Deal agenda for increased public ownership of utilities, not only through the Tennessee Valley Authority, but through some other prosecutions. And the New Deal did work to limit work hours, largely by increasing the power of labor unions to demand better contracts as far as the workers were concerned, right, out of management. Most important, of course, the New Deal, as I've already suggested, was reflation. And if you add in the public works program, then you would have a more Keynesian program actually for fixing the economy, which is largely what the New Dealers pursued through the course of the 1930s. That public works program of the 1930s was probably more important for political than economic reasons. Because over the course of the 1930s, as many as 3 million Americans were employed by the various New Deal public works programs, by the WPA, by the CCC, by the PWA, and by various others. And those are Americans who aren't in the army of the unemployed. Those are Americans who therefore don't pose a threat in terms of the political system, right? Those are the Americans who aren't then camped on the National Mall. The amount of money spent on public works is never enough, according to Keynes' own arithmetic, actually to reverse the trend of the Depression. But keeping those Americans in work, rather than having them lose their faith in the political system, is probably vitally important politically. And of course, you can see that if you look at the graph of unemployment through the Roosevelt administration. This is essentially the reverse of the GDP graph that I showed you, right? You see this rise in unemployment from 1929 right up to 1933, and then you see this drop, with the exception of the rise in 37, 38 there, and then a drop again. So when we talk about, oh, by the way, just for the record, generally speaking, we are pretty clear that the reason for that rise in unemployment or that drop in productivity in 37 and 38 is because Roosevelt pulled back on the New Deal too soon, right? He sought to impose economies after being reelected, actually even before being reelected, and reduced the amount of people who were employed by the federal government. And Keynes said, don't do that, it's too soon. Right? And in 1938, the government doubled down on its public works, and lo and behold, recovery seems to have resumed. So when we think about the way the country escaped its plight in 1931, this is what we should think of. As I say, it's neither the sort of Gabriel over the White House mission, there's no sending of tank squads to murder gangsters, and there is also not exactly the Charlie Ross agenda, because there is not progressive taxation. It is a very sort of varied program here, which includes the stimulus of a monetary shock at the beginning, and then a program gradually of seeking to induce demand and keep people employed and build dams and stuff like that. So the one thing we might think about in terms of the fact of the recovery, not only of the fact of the recovery, is that the New Deal is important for the speed of its recovery. The rate of the recovery is very rapid in the 1930s. GDP growth is between 8 and 11%, depending on which estimates you use, over the course of the 1930s. As one economist notes, it's the greatest expansion. The first 4 years of Roosevelt's presidency, his first term, in other words, is the greatest peacetime 4-year expansion, right, in American history. These are spectacular rates of growth, even for an economy coming out of a depression. When we look at this, when people look at the Depression and think about it, they don't always think about it in those terms. Because even though there's this almost 4-year drop, and then there's that over 4-year recovery, right? People are still thinking about that black trend line, that things still aren't back to normal, right? Throughout the entirety of Roosevelt's first 2 terms of office. But what people at the time see is this rate of rise of that curve, that things are palpably getting better very quickly. That's why Roosevelt gets reelected in 1936 by a larger margin than any president since James Monroe ran unopposed, right? Because although the economy is not back to where it had been, people see that it is moving in the right direction and very quickly. So if you want to know the answer to the question of how the country escaped its plight, that's your answer, right, is the New Deal, and that is the rate at which it did so. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for letting me speak at you, and I'll be happy to take any questions if that's what you'd like. So thank you very much.
Is there any questions, comments?
You had, on one slide, you had the drop in prices from Germany.
Yes, I did.
And it ends in 1933.
Ah.
What happens after 1933?
The Nazis begin to make up numbers that are not historically accurate, and so we don't really know. Yeah. I mean, it becomes unlawful to be unemployed in Nazi Germany, right? So, yeah, so you've solved that problem. You put enough people in camps, you can raise the employment rate fairly quickly. Yeah, so people don't generally trust any of the 30s era economic data for Germany, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
What do you think about a contemporary interpretation of Keynesian economics like applied to the recession today?
I was hoping somebody would ask that question. And would you believe I have a slide for you? See, you got to have your encore material ready. Yeah, okay. This is a graph comparing the Great Depression with what I'm calling the current unpleasantness, because we don't really have a name for the economic crisis of the modern era, although some people have started suggesting we should call this now the long depression. So on the graph here, you see them graphed month on month, right? And beginning in the first month of the crisis and extending down 91 some months into the crisis, right? The pink line is the Great Depression. So you see the Great Depression gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse till down in here, and again, and this is about our not quite 4-year range, then begins to get better. And in fact, as of about month 82 or therefore, gets above where you started out. This is an index, right? So 100% is where you start out your crisis. And so you see the pink line is as the 81st month or so above where you started out. The green line is where we are now, or we're the beginning back in 2007 and extending up to now. Of course, it doesn't get as bad. It never goes as low as it did during the Great Depression. But then it lingers below the 100% mark for a very, very long time, and of course ultimately is surpassed by the recovery of the 1930s in what would be, in our arithmetic, very recent times. So how do we think about that in Keynesian terms, as you suggest? One interpretation, I think probably the most common one now, is that in early 2009, when President Obama came into office, the enactment of a large Keynesian stimulus was the right thing to do in terms of seeking to counteract that falling line of productivity. But as was true of the Great Depression, it wasn't enough. A lot of it was absorbed by regressive actions taken by the states. Right? It's one of the problems of having a federal budget system like we do in the United States. And a lot of it, of course, was smaller because the Obama administration simply didn't ask for one that was large enough in the first place. They essentially negotiated against themselves and anticipated what Congress would and wouldn't support. And so it was probably not as big as it should have been. So you get this kind of gradual but relatively anemic recovery that, again, then is outpaced by the one of the 1930s. So we probably should have had one, is the answer, right? We should have had a more Keynesian program. We might have had, possibly, theoretically, a more Keynesian monetary policy in the Obama era as well. I mean, the equivalent of going off gold now would have been much harder to effect, right? When you have a gold standard and you can go off it, you can immediately achieve an inflationary shock in a way that is not available to you once you've done that. However, those of you who, probably may be just me, who were privy to the debate some years ago about whether President Obama should mint a platinum coin worth approximately $1 trillion to get rid of the federal debt, which the law apparently allowed him to do, right, would have possibly had similar effects, right? The Obama administration, again, just took that off the table as too silly to contemplate, which, they had a point, but it would have been spectacular. There's no question about that. I guess the answer to your question is that a Keynesian approach seems to have been good in terms of having unemployment in 2009 just touch 10% rather than go over it. And the other thing we can say about Keynesian analysis of the current situation is that in Europe, where governments have pursued more aggressively austere, which is to say anti-Keynesian policies, the recovery has been even more anemic. Right? And so that seems to be sort of negative evidence in favor of the Keynesian prescription. Yeah.
Milton Friedman wouldn't be very happy with your omission of the Federal Reserve policy. For example, in 1931, the Fed sharply raised interest rates when the unemployment rate was above 15%. Then in 1937-38, that recession, according to Friedman, that was due to the Fed doubled the percentage reserve requirement on banks, sucking a lot of funds out of the banks where they couldn't lend it out. And so he would put much more, although I tend personally to agree with the Keynesian view, Friedman would say monetary policy has a lot to do with what happened here. It's the gross mistakes. When England went off the gold standard in 1931, the Fed jumped the discount rate from 1.5% to 3%, even though the unemployment rate was over 15%.
Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. I think that, what Roosevelt did with the monetary policy was something that he did because the Fed wasn't doing it, right? And he had to essentially pursue his own monetary policy, especially in 33 and 34, against the wishes of the Federal Reserve banks, if not the Federal Reserve Board. And you're right that even more important perhaps than 1931 for Friedman was the raising of rates in 1928, which quite possibly precipitated the 1929 crisis by bringing investment back to the United States instead of having it go overseas where it was more desperately needed at that point. I wouldn't disagree with any of that in terms of its useful background. It's just, I don't mean this to be an encyclopedic explanation of the Great Depression. And I do view what Roosevelt did as essentially, and I think Friedman did view it as essentially the right thing to do in terms of monetary policy. About the 1937 point that you raised, there are several contractionary influences actually in 37, 38. Probably the largest one, I still think, is the fiscal one, where Roosevelt seeks to cut back on WPA employment. There is also the increase of reserve requirements. Maybe even more important than that, though, is that the Federal Reserve seeks to sterilize gold imports to the United States. One important piece of background here is that after 1933, when Hitler comes to power in Germany, European gold begins to flood into the United States, especially after Roosevelt stabilizes the banks. And so people see, rightly, that the United States is a safer place to invest their money than Europe is. And so a lot of European gold begins to come into the United States, and that increases over the course of the 1930s as Hitler begins to pose an more obvious threat. To such a level that, in fact, Roosevelt's Treasury in 37 decides there's too much gold coming into the country. We need to get control of inflation that is being caused by all this gold coming in, so we're not going to let it become part of the money supply. So that's called sterilization, right? So they essentially put it in a hole, and unlike Keynes, don't allow people to dig it back up, right? And so that has a retarding effect on monetary policy in 37 and 38 also. So there's at least those three contractionary influence, all of which would be contraindicated by a Keynesian analysis. So that's absolutely right. You have to think of monetary and fiscal policy as working together here.
There's also Goldfinger's plot, right?
There's also Goldfinger's plot. Well, as you know, Goldfinger's plot is an echo of the Great Depression, right? Only in reverse, right? What Roosevelt does is he says, you all have to bring in your gold, and we're going to put it in vaults. In fact, we don't have a vault big enough to put it in, so we're going to build a new depository at Fort Knox. We'll put a lot of people to work, actually literally digging a hole in the ground and putting the money in it, as Keynes says that we should. And then that's where much of the gold remains until, with the success of the post-war recovery programs, European countries begin to do runs on the dollar and reduce the gold supply in Fort Knox, through the market, and that's what leads to the panic that is behind the nefarious Goldfinger plot. So,
As a serious question,
yeah.
I was struck by your discussion of Charlie Ross's article, and it seemed like he has the Keynesian analysis, but not the Keynesian solution. And I was wondering what accounts for the seeming lack of connection between the analysis and then what he proposes.
I don't think there's entirely a disconnect. I think it's more a question of what Keynes would have said would have worked quickest, which he as an economist would have been highly qualified to say. And so a monetary shock and mass employment would have been probably quicker than changing the tax structure, because that takes a lot of time to filter through. And also probably what he thought would have been politically feasible, which he would have been less qualified to say. Keynes actually did favor in the 30s a more progressive tax structure in general, although he also favored preserving a certain amount of inequality for what I think we would have to call moral rather than actually economic purposes. He says something like, people who are inclined to prey on their fellow man should be allowed instead to prey on their bank balances, right? And sort of if they have that kind of drive, they should be allowed to be tyrants of their money rather than of their fellow men. And therefore, the rapacious instincts would be curbed somewhat by allowing people to accumulate private wealth and not having, therefore, too progressive a tax structure. However, Keynes believed, and a lot of macroeconomists seem to think he was right, that there were actually no drawbacks in terms of economic growth to a fairly progressive tax structure. So just wouldn't have worked very quickly.
Can you tell us more about the background of Charlie Ross in 1931 and what's going on in St. Louis, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the dynamics of, here he graduated from the University of Missouri in 1905, and he's become this journalistic expert.
This is you, Tim.
This might be the Tim Boss here.
No. Ronald Farrar, you may know as a historian, more or less, of Walter Williams and the journalism school, and a Pulitzer, too, if I'm not mistaken, has done more of a biographical work on Ross. But he was working not in St. Louis, he was actually working in Washington, D.C. at the time. So I think like any other journalist, and that doesn't necessarily show up extensively in the piece that he wrote that won the prize, but he's going on what his sources tell him. So, I just think he did a work of journalism. The people that he talked to espoused a particular economic philosophy that made sense.
But he didn't present it that way.
Pardon me?
He didn't present it that way.
No,
It's
that's what I said.
It's not in the style of
Yeah.
ex-Joe economist says and Bill economist says that, right?
Right, it's not a he
presented
said,
as-
she said, kind of citing the sources. So, that's what I was suggesting. That doesn't show up in the piece, but I think that's how he would have done it. So, I'm not adding a whole lot of context to the question, other than to say you should read Ronald Farrar's biography of him. But the context that I was providing is that here's a person who understands journalism as a public service and as a form of public education, and that's what he's trying to do in the piece. But that was carving out that role of journalism was one that not everyone embraced. right? So by espousing that particular view, he was also a practitioner of that point of view, and that was the kind of journalism that he was trying to accomplish. And it wasn't a lot of that kind of journalism being done at the time.
I mean, the prize he won is correspondence. I don't actually know the history of the Pulitzer Prizes that much, but that's be more than one for what we would call punditry anyway, right? I mean, correspondence is like, it's like meant more in the turn of the century sense, where it was letters from Washington, right?
Right.
Letters from Washington where there would kind of be some reportage, but a lot of offering, a lot of things that we would regard now as opinion.
Yeah. But that category only existed from the late 20s to, I think, the early 40s, if I'm not
Where did they change it to later then?
Well, something like it came back as explanatory journalism.
But is there a different one for opinion? Is there a
Yeah, there's
separate
a-
one for editorial? Good.
It's striking how Ross's diagnosis of the problem in 1931 was very technical and economic, whereas his solution and your solution about what ultimately saved the day was very much political or political economy. It's quite an interesting thing just to think about, but I wonder to what extent you can zoom in really on the key development being the formation of labor, the recognition of labor, both in terms of the purchasing power problem and dilemma that you referred to, but also in terms of the integrity of the political system, the representation of a new class of citizens in an important voting bloc, an important constituent of the Democratic Party as it becomes in the New Deal. And then if you do that, instead of looking at GDP as a sort of barometer of recovery, and you look at employment rate, unemployment rate, isn't the answer there that actually the New Deal, whilst it is part of the solution, it's not the ultimate solution. That only comes with war production in the late 1930s and during the Second World War. So basically, I guess the question is, to what extent can we really zoom in on labor, trade unions, both in the economic context, but also in its political context?
Well, that's a tall order. The question is, Ross's solution is essentially a political one to an economic problem. So is Roosevelt's solution, and indeed that is what is on Keynes's mind as well. And before I get on to the second part of what you suggested, I mean, there's a reason for that, and it's essentially the way Ross frames it, which is to say, this is a crisis of our civilization, right? Meeting this economic crisis is a test of whether we can preserve our basic institutions. So for all of them, that's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about, genuine chaos, revolution, something really catastrophic. So none of them is thinking simply in terms of engineering a turnaround in the dry way that, quantitative easing or something would imply, right? They're all thinking about how do we stave off revolt, which is why one of the calculations is, well, a lot of things will work, but what will work quickest, right, is one of the things that they all think about. So the question about the role of labor unions is an intriguing one. I mean, people of the class of, I don't know about Ross personally, but I'm going to hazard a guess this is true. People of the class of Charles Ross, certainly people of the class of Maynard Keynes and of Franklin Roosevelt, right, were not enthusiasts of labor unions, it's fair to say, right? They were 19th century people, right, who thought of labor unions as at best a necessary evil. And that's probably the extreme outside of where they would be, right? It's only, again, because it comes to be seen as probably better than some of the dire alternatives that they become an integral part of the New Deal, right? Specifically for the Roosevelt administration, it gets into the question of American institutions. Roosevelt and many of the people around him probably would have been just as happy if their initial solution to negotiating prices and workplace conditions had been allowed to stand, which is that of the National Recovery Administration of 1933, which got representatives of labor together with representatives of management and representatives of consumers in each industry around a table, real or metaphoric, and got them to agree on appropriate conditions and appropriate prices. And the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. in 1935. And the substitute for that was the Wagner Act, which encouraged unions to form and get these deals for themselves. So encouraging labor unions was a second best, essentially, or at least a second route for the administration. If the administration couldn't get these cooperative solutions because they were considered to be unconstitutional, then it said, well, let the unions get them for itself, right? And it's with the Wagner Act that unionization rates really go up. They go up a bit from 1933 to 1935, but they go up a lot after 1935. And therefore, unions are, as you correctly suggest, an integral solution to the long-term problems suggested by the Great Depression. It's because of unionization that workplace conditions improve, that there are dental plans, that there are shorter working hours, there are all of those things. And that's part of the way the Roosevelt administration gets what it wants. And it's a vision of the economy as being one where you don't actually set wages from some central administrative point, but you empower unions so that they can negotiate for better conditions, right? So that's something that sort of creeps gradually upon the administration. By the time you get to the war and you get to increase production, unions are actually a threat again, because of course you have an oversupply of jobs and an undersupply of labor, and you want to make sure that unions don't hold up wartime production. So the calculation shifts very much back in favor of the administration seeking to control unions at that point. So it's not an ideological commitment one way or the other as far as unions are concerned. It's more of a practical calculation as to what their best use can be, I think.
I have a question, maybe it's more of a comment, but the images you showed at first of Gabriel over the White House, and realizing also in 1932 that Walter Duranty won the Pulitzer for foreign correspondence, I believe, on his reports from Moscow.
On how great it was in Moscow? Yes, yeah.
And how it was all working. Do you see any kind of connection between, we didn't do all that, they gave a Pulitzer these two very different kind of people and how they resonated in very different ways with the time. If that makes sense to you. Because I think did they pull Duranty's Pulitzer, or did he just?
Any of you guys know? I don't know. I know that to many Americans, certainly Charlie Ross type Americans at the time, right, there were sort of, two evil possible outcomes. One would be communism, one would be fascism, right? And the idea was to steer a middle course between them somehow, right? I mean, Hearst was never going to advocate for communism. Hearst couldn't even abide labor unions, let alone Soviet-style communism. So to him, temporary fascism was the preferable solution, right? But it's certainly, again, if you start to say things, again, if you read the Charlie Ross essay, that's a necessary background, I think, to understanding why he approaches it the way he does. Because one of the things he says in there, he says, the true saviors of capitalism are going to be those who are capable of critiquing it from within, essentially, right? So what he's saying there is if we don't want to have Soviet-style communism forced upon us, or fascism, then we're going to have to sort of look at it from the angle of constructive criticism. That's all kind of necessary background to understand the rhetorical approach that he takes in that article, and indeed that a lot of Americans took at the time, that we're going to have to modify capitalism to rein it in order to save it. Right? So. Yeah.
Somebody back there.
Way in the back, yeah.
Oh, Victor.
I have a question about the role of economic expertise in shaping the response to the Depression. And I was thinking about this because Ross isn't an economist, he's a journalist, although he's commenting on things that would be the domain of professional economists today. It is professional academic economists like Keynes who come out of this whole episode with more prestige, more influence than they've ever had before in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And in a way that's a little bit surprising because a lot of conventional economic expertise would have agreed with Mellon in 29 or 30. The thing to do is purge the rottenness and liquidate everything. And in a way it's surprising that the American public wouldn't come out of the Great Depression with more distrust of economists, more belief in common sense economics coming from outside the ivory tower. So how is it that you think people like Ross aren't remembered as much as Keynes today, and how did the economists so successfully say some economists might have gotten it wrong in the 20s, but now we've developed a new paradigm. Now we've gotten it right. Now you can trust us to handle it in the future.
One might very well ask the same thing of our current moment. The Queen famously went to the LSE and asked, how has one's economists got it so wrong, right? And they didn't really have an answer for her, right, in terms of understanding the crisis. And yet, they're still the same people running, macroeconomics as were 10 years ago. That's a sort of glib answer. I mean, thinking historically about it, going back to something that I pointed out sort of in passing, there's a reason that Roosevelt's only sort of real economics advisors are agricultural economists, i.e. not real economists in the parlance of the day, right? I mean, much was made of the fact that Rex Tugwell and George Warren were, dairy economists or, people who were more at home in the fields than actually in the classroom. But that's because, as you rightly say, the economics profession proper was in pretty bad odor in 1933. Nobody wanted to listen to those guys who had been predicting for years that prosperity was just around the corner and that recovery would come automatically in the ordinary course of things, right? So at this point, there are some fairly heretical people. Keynes was at this point a perpetual Cassandra, right, in his own point of view, who kept saying, disaster will ensue if you do this, and then it did, and then, people still wouldn't listen to him the next time around, right? So how did the folks like that get back in the saddle? Well, I mean, because Keynes turned out to be right a lot of the time, right? He had been right as far as people could tell at the time about what would happen in the 1920s. He had been right about Britain going back on the gold standard. He had been right about a program of recovery from the Great Depression. He turned out to have a very good grasp of how to implement Lend-Lease and then of Bretton Woods, and so he seemed to be somebody who had his finger on the pulse of macroeconomics. And Keynesian macroeconomics, which of course was the exact opposite of what had been economic orthodoxy before 1929, became a new orthodoxy, right? I mean, Keynes was triumphant because he had been saying these things right the way along and was proved correct, more or less, at every turn. So I think that's less difficult to understand than why the people who kept predicting inflation any second after 2008 are still regarded with respect today, right? In a period where we are now again in food price deflation in the Western world. So I think that it's more optimistic to think about the economists of the 30s having come out of it looking good, because they were not the ones who were looking bad after the crash of 1929.
Somebody in the back behind you, I thought had their hand up, or they're not, they lost.
Is there anyone back? Yeah, okay.
There's no one there.
To think about contemporary economic journalists, Ross seems to remind me of Paul Krugman, for instance, with the New York Times, but I feel like Paul Krugman takes a lot of criticism for having like a left liberal bias because he publishes exclusively with the New York Times. Do you think it's possible to have somebody in a modern day setting like Ross who is as well respected by both sides?
What a deflating question. I mean, I think Krugman's, Krugman's, I think, coming from a different place than Ross, right? Because he's an economist who goes into punditry as opposed to a pundit who goes into thinking about economics, right? Which is kind of, they may meet in the middle. And I think those who object to what Krugman has to say object more when he talks about non-economic matters, right, than when he talks about economic matters. But more broadly, is it possible for there to be someone objectively respectable? First of all, I don't know how objectively respected Charles Ross was in 1931. Do you know? Okay. I mean, there are economic histories of the rise of, as I'm sure Tim would tell you, but I'm poaching on his turf for a second here. There are economic histories of the rise of objectivity as an ideal within the newspaper profession, which shows that as the price of newsprint falls and there's a consolidation of control in a small set of hands, that the rise of objectivity as an ideal becomes a way to gain market share for certain outlets, right, through the middle of the 20th century. And it's not until the landscape is again shifted in our more modern era that that ideal comes under attack. Right, what you see nowadays in the more polarized political landscape and the more polarized political media landscape looks a lot more like the early 20th century or late 19th century in terms of the way newspapers and newspaper men, as it would have been then mostly, talked. Right, so the shifting economics of the market may have as much to do with anything as anything. But you know, there used to be far more polarized rhetoric. There is again far more polarized rhetoric. Whether we will again see the cool days of the middle 20th century, I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. Go ahead.
And your take on journalism history is not far from the consensus.
Okay, that's good to know. Yes. As Keynes would say, the thing to do is not to be right, but to be wrong at the same time as everyone else. You see, so.
I just want to say I was struck by the heaviness that we placed on kind of in this discussion, the idea that we have to change or soften the edges of capitalism in order to save American